Okay, so this is my commentary on chapter 24 of the Proverbs. Sometimes I give a bit of an introduction before I get into the verses. Sometimes I find it a bit difficult to start these episodes. Usually they're quite long in nature. They span a period of days, weeks. Each chapter takes a lot of time to get through. And I find myself being at this precipice of embarking on a journey every time I do it, because I know that there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of potential for discovery, for self-improvement, reflection. And there are times that I feel that I'm not up to the challenge, that I feel weak, that there's something about me, there's something deep within me that is not willing to accept the responsibility that's in front of me. And so I'd like to begin by saying that aspect of me, that weakness, I wish it to be done away with, to be crushed under the weight of more productive pursuits. So to begin here, we have a 2-verse continuity. Be not you envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them. For their heart studieth destruction, and their lips talketh mischief. So let's start with the first. So we have to discuss what it means to be envious, and then we have to discuss again what it means to be evil. And I say again because evil, or the sort of the trifecta of the Proverbs here, the fool, the wicked, and the evil, occupy similar spaces, and yet they are not entirely the same conceptually. When we speak of envy, what do we mean? Certainly envy can be characterized, I think, as a desire, perhaps a sophisticated emotion. When somebody is envious, they have a reason to feel the way that they feel. So we can say perhaps that it is a base emotion wed to some reason. It is a desire that we wish to have what somebody else has. Perhaps we feel ourselves more deserving of a particular type of having relative to another person. And this envy produces within the self an aspect of, well, fundamentally I think we can say that it influences our attention. The attention goes towards the creation or the creative element of somebody else's productive means. And I think by that standard, by desiring the creative element of somebody else, we are ignoring our own potential. Now I'd like to go a little bit farther with this word envy, because it's going to be important when we get to the word evil. Envy in part comes from the Latin word invidia, which referred to feelings of ill will, jealousy, or resentment towards somebody else's possessions, success, or advantages. Invidia was derived from the verb invidere, meaning to look at with malice, to cast an evil eye upon. Now, I've hinted at this, but I think that there is perhaps a richer landscape here to discuss envy. Now, I referred to the creative element, and that envy is the attention directed towards a creative element in some other person. It may be born of many things, I suppose, but at least in the case of a person who has achieved something by their own merits, I believe that the envious eye is looking towards that creative element. Now, of course, there's a degree to which they are seeing the product, and perhaps it could be argued that what is missed is the creative element, is the aspect of the individual that the attention is drawn towards, that actually succeeded and produced the desirable outcome. But I think logically, if we are to say that this envy is to look at somebody in disdain for their rightfully gained achievements, we must necessarily consider the whole picture. Now, we can consider part of the picture, certainly. But just because we are ignorant of the rest of the map, it doesn't mean that our judgment is independent of the rest of the map. The effects will be much the same. And so even if one believes themselves to think that, let's say, just a material possession, quite a superficial judgment or distinction, that they are desirous of this sort of thing, perhaps it's a nice car, perhaps it's a beautiful wife, it could be any number of things. Even if the attention and the mind is focused on the object, to be envious, there is this connection to the individual that has it. Again, the ill will that's attributed towards the individual for having these things that are desired by another. The creative element, we all have it. We all have the ability to direct our attention, to consider and to put forth meaning into the world. This is our true value, is that we can create value and put it out into the world. We can bring heaven down to earth and raise material circumstances into something that is purposeful, meaningful. Perhaps we can lower them at times. But the creative element in man, it is such a fundamental load-bearing component of his being, of his existence. It is something for which his reason and his heart is meant to facilitate. The creative element is, we could say, the beating heart of his soul. Without it, he would be much diminished. He would be a being of much lower capacity. For to create something is to bring something into existence. Sort of a divine quality. But of course we play in the sandbox of the divine. It is not that we are the gods that are producing new reality. It is the reality that we are given to play with and to reorganize in different ways. But given our creative component, given that this is such a fundamental aspect of us, and given that the creative element is all around us, it is not just within our minds, or it is not just the fact that we are able to reorganize the material substrate that's in front of us that we are then allowed to appreciate the creative element, it is all around us. It is within life. It is within inanimate objects. It is within the rocks and the air. There's something fundamental about something, about anything that is in existence, independent of mind, that has the element, the fundamental block of creation. So again, I'll raise the question, what does it mean, regardless of one's view of the map, that one would disdain the creative element more than just creation, but the capacity to create, to modify, again, to instill purpose and meaning into the world. Now, there's a lot, I think, that could be said about what word to be used here. Reality, the world, the earth. Is it limited to the material sphere of the world? We have, both the material sphere and then the more of the, not necessarily dimensional, because that wouldn't really make any sense, but that of the earth, that of our experience, perhaps that we can somewhat perceive, but also we're somewhat distant from the whole of reality, the whole of the map that we are a part of, and yet we can see and we can experience but a slice of. Now, with this in mind, I think there's also something to be said about the nature of the relationship between person A, that is envious, and then person B, who has successfully produced something. That, like a wire that wires a house, that facilitates the flow of the electrons through it, this person has transmitted information from a place that is perhaps lower on some scale to a place that is higher. And because of this transaction, there is this aspect of jealousy on the part of person A. Now, from what I can tell, where this attention goes, there's a lot of complexity, to be sure. But if this attention is devoted towards something that which is outside of their control, the person's actions are independent of theirs, that worrying or having ill will towards a transition of information between one state and another because it benefits somebody else is, I think, to miss the point. What one would truly gain, instead of being envious and choosing to look away or to be selfish and be closed off to that exchange, again, to that transaction. Rather, it would seem most productive to pay attention to the transfer of information between that lower state to the higher, and instead of being envious, be curious. Because then one not only would be able to afford a better relationship with somebody, but also be empowered with the ability or the inspiration, some idea to do somewhat similar things, to figure out how they can create something in a like manner, perhaps not the same, but with their own creative element. Now, the interesting component is when we consider the person to be evil. And before I get into that, I think it's important to discuss what it means, or at least what I've conceptualized up until this point, of what an evil person is. The evil person sits atop this three-person hierarchy in the Proverbs. The fool is at the bottom, then there's the wicked, and then there is the evil person. The fool can get and occupy this space because of his arrogance or his ignorance, perhaps his lack of foresight, and a degree of his own selfishness. I think that they all have selfishness in common. The evil is the type of person, again, much like I had mentioned with the envious. It really doesn't matter if one sees the entire map or not. There can be a component the component of the map of all that is, for example, or of the interrelatedness of human interactions. And yet this evil person may still commit, or I should say that the person may still commit acts of evil, even if it is out of their own blindness. So again, to return to this, the evil person, the person that is so self-absorbed that it is more than just being selfish. It must be an improper relationship, an improper view of the way that this whole thing works. It is the belief, and perhaps the desire, that the self is something independent of everything else. That the self has a divine potential, that it is itself divine, and that it is an axis around which the self can rotate and produce its own world, produce its own This is where it gets difficult, because there's a degree in which we produce our own value and meaning in life and purpose, but it's not necessarily considered to be evil. It's the way in which we interface. It's the way in which we project our understanding of the map. So it's not necessarily that it is this process that is concerning. It is more so what is done with the map. At some level there is a denial. I think there must be a denial of the interrelatedness of various parts. That the evil feel that punishment will not come to find them, or if it does, their actions, their behaviors, as long as they can get off and do as they please, the true punishment really does not concern them, even if it means the end of their experience, the end of their existence. So there is this profound element of selfishness, the inability to connect to other things for broader, more sophisticated purposes. The evil, on a fundamental level, is the type of being that wishes to undo creation. The creative element being the generative element, the coming into, the coming to be. And while we have elements within this life that are undoing, that seem to be contrary to creation, they are as they are, and we live with them the best we can, and we deal with the questions that they bring up to us. Life and death or death in general, is one of these things. There are all sorts of endings that we can experience. But it is not the ending. There are beginnings and endings for larger purposes. But we don't have endings for the sake of endings. That we don't have a situation in which all of intelligible reality consumes itself into nothingness. And yet, the fundamental belief, which I think is afforded by this auto-actualization, is this sort of black hole type structure of mind, that all meaning and everything is just sucked into it. Now, this is sort of a common or a layperson imagining of what happens when information enters the black hole. I'm just saying here that I'm imagining a structure, regardless of this happens within the black hole or not, that the information that is perceived by the evil person enters in only to satisfy the components of the self, to fulfill the experience of the soul, such that their will is bent towards the destruction of all intelligible means. Now, I think that this is something much like a person can commit an act of evil and be unaware of it because of the aspect of the map that they see. I think that this can occur sort of at the within as well. I think there are limits to that. I think everybody has the capacity to see and to undo certain aspects of their philosophy and to see the light. But I just mentioned that to say that there's a lot of possibility here. The overt evil is something that I think is a little bit more comforting to think about because it's out in the open. It's not hiding from anybody. Or it's not deceived. It is something that knows what it is. Be not you envious against evil men. What would it mean to envy an evil man? Certainly this seems to me to be a bit of a contradiction, and perhaps that's the point. For to want or to desire the creation of an evil man is to want and to desire perhaps the selfish component, the auto-divination, but it is also to desire the destructive element, rather than, and this is much worse than just basic envy, which is just the poor allocation of attention towards somebody else's creative element. And here we have the poor allocation of attention, but it is the desire of some perceived temporary act of creation in the process, in the deceiving process of destroying it all, of taking it all in within itself, to be meaningless and nothing. Be not you envious against evil men, neither desire to be with them, for their heart studies destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. So I think it is particularly telling in verse 2 that we have the saying, for their hearts study destruction. For what does it mean to destroy something? I think I've mentioned it at least to a certain degree. It means to bring something to an end, to break it apart, to make what it is something different. It is to bring it down. It is to reduce the purposeful and meaningful element, to break it into component parts. But of course it is more than just breaking it down into component parts. There's an element of damage, of attack, of obliteration. Now when I say breaking down into component parts, it is necessarily connected with that other thing that I had mentioned. It is the reduction of the meaningful component. I think there are plenty of things that we can analyze and examine, break down to their component parts, and still retain the meaningful element. I think within destruction, what we find is the dissolution of the meaningful element. And I understand that that statement, the meaningful element, is difficult to define or to describe, because there is a realm of subjectivity, or what we would describe as subjectivity. That there is something about the individual and his participation in value creation that is slippery, that I feel like, at least from my conception as I think about it now, I know it to exist, but at the same time, by itself, in the mind, just as a concept or a thought that has yet to be, of course, is something that lacks a foothold in the world. And so the meaningful element, I think, necessarily must be something that exists. And it also must be tied necessarily to a network, perhaps one mind or a group of minds. In this situation, since we are talking about the heart, since we're talking about destruction, you see, my mind gets lost in the potential, and it's hard to focus on one path. But I know that in this direction lies an interesting reflection on the matter of the value structure within the mind of man, the value structure that is shared, the value structure that is perhaps we could say individualized to a degree that increases the probability for, what would one say, falsehood, perhaps, but falsehood relative to what? When we say falsehood, it only makes sense if we say falsehood relative to that which is the mover, that which exists outside of him, that there is something that we would recognize as valuable and as salient to the human mind, independent of him. That if we make that assumption prior to, then we don't get lost in this sort of subjective rabbit hole, that everything is relative, or that his own thoughts are meaningless, or that the actions and behaviors in the world are meaningless. So back to this matter of the heart studying destruction. I went down this trail by discussing the aspectual, by mentioning that if we have a whole, if we break something down into its aspects, it's not necessarily the case that because we are examining something in its aspect that we have then destroyed the meaning or the integrity of the whole. But we can also find a situation in which we have some whole, and we can understand that there's a certain type of breaking or certain type of relationship, or destroying, in this case, it's a good word for it, in which our view, our visualization, more in the spiritual sense, not in the physical sense, but our view of that whole can be disrupted or can be willed in such a way that we break the bonds of the aspects so that we no longer recognize the whole. And I think that that is a type of destruction. And again, I want to reiterate for myself that the other type is more of an analysis. It is an attempt to understand. For with many things, understanding the aspects that make up the whole tell us quite a bit about the whole, and of course of the aspects themselves. So two different relationships. For their hearts study destruction. So we have individuals here who, instead of are devoted to understanding that which is true by understanding the components of something, wish instead to understand something enough to disrupt any meaningful connection that would produce in the human mind some identifiable, recognizable whole. Now, this could be an object, it could be a concept, it could be a human being, both physical and sort of psychological. There are many different paths, I think, that this can permeate or take. For their heart studies destruction. Now, I'll speak to my own experience here. And the most immediate example that I can think of is doing this sort of thing, reading the Bible and talking through it to myself. I would like to think that this pursuit is towards examining the aspectual in order to have a better appreciation for the whole. Now, what this has done for me, it's sometimes difficult to articulate. But I'm examining concepts that are fundamental to our sight, or our, I use the word experience often, but I don't want to use one word too often to lose its meaning. I want to continue to bring something forth. And that's part of it, I think. It's tapping into that generative capacity of the mind of man to understand the ways in which, in this situation, man can find himself related to another man, or, in a broader sense, how the individual can find himself related to the world, which would include, physical objects and other human beings in this psychological domain. And I think that I also have an understanding of what it means to have my heart study destruction, unfortunately. And it's difficult to describe exactly how this takes hold, but it's almost like an addiction that is geared towards something that is false or unproductive. It is, I think often, at least in my situation, is to satisfy the superficial desires, such that my longing for some richer, more fundamental understanding, when it bumps up against the aspect of fatigue and the understanding of how difficult it is to enter into the types of experiences that I know to be out there, to exist, to be possible to be had, there is this drawing away, there is this sinking feeling, almost as if one is going to enter into a very difficult workout or a very difficult day period at work, that there is some event that is going to take a lot of energy, and preparing oneself mentally for it, I think I can often find myself psyching myself out, to use a more colloquial expression. And rather than just doing, there is all of this perseveration and psychological roundabout that causes considerable anxiety and stress. That, of course, doesn't need to be, but the result of this sort of situation is the heart desiring destruction. The mind is going around different aspects, but eventually it stresses itself out to a point where the examination of the aspects turn into an excuse not to fall into the type of experience, to experience oneness, or that whole. It's such a strange thing. I wish it didn't happen, but I currently still struggle with it, unfortunately. It certainly has gotten better. It's gotten better since I've embarked on my journey to really understand the tradition that I have been a part of for most of my life. For their heart studies destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. Now, I remember a while ago I went into the conversation of the word mischief, and I remember it being quite productive, useful. And so I think it's going to be good to go through this again. I'll try not to take too long on this word, but this is a fundamental component of this verse, mischief. So what can we say about the etymological chain of the word mischief? So breaking down the word mis and chief, or chief. Mis means something that is wrong, incorrect. Chief, something from the Old French, which originally meant head. It could also be known or referred to as somebody that is in charge. It can indicate an action or a behavior. So there are a few different ways by which we can go about describing this word. That there is some incorrect way in which one behaves. We can also say that there is a false allocation of a person that is in charge. They're thinking themselves in a place where they ought not to be, and such that their actions and behaviors at the level that they choose to act causes false things to occur. And so I think we are probably more accustomed to the first, but the second, I think, is also a useful thought experiment to think through. So to begin with the first, in which we have some misbehavior, we have incorrect behavior, or an incorrect action. The question in my mind is, well, what determines an incorrect action or an incorrect behavior? I think there are plenty of things. I think the most obvious is that sociocultural standard. That there are places that are appropriate for certain actions, there are other places that are appropriate for other actions. Sometimes the two may intermix, sometimes the two are not congruent. I think there are levels and layers in which our society, our culture, chooses to identify that which is acceptable and unacceptable. We live in this strange period now, post-Enlightenment, post-Protestant Reformation, in which we have had many liberties. We've had the allocation of many different liberties. Perhaps we could say the misallocation of many different liberties. But all the same, we consider ourselves to be quite open, accepting of behaviors. And yet our openness and our acceptance of behaviors has limits. It must necessarily. Now, when the limits are obliterated, it is then that we begin to experience a little bit of a rocking of the boat. Water comes in to the hull, and we panic a little bit. And so then we realize, that there are certain constraints that actually are required to keep the ship of human civilization afloat. Now, I think within the ship, there are certain things that we can do amongst each other that are highly variable, that we can remove certain constraints and place others, put others in place. And that may modify and may mold our interactions. It may facilitate certain types of feelings and desires. It may prevent others. But all the same, within that window, within that acceptable window, the ship stays afloat. So within the first interpretation of the word mischief, when we are considering improper behavior, what we are running up into are two different standards. Or potentially three, but I think fundamentally two. One is the standard of man, and the second is the standard that is God's standard. The standard by which nobody can deny that if there is a large hole in the hull of our ship will sink, and we will be stranded at sea. Now, much like Martin Luther, we can say that he was a mischievous person to upset the established order of the Roman Catholic Church. And I suppose we can argue about the result of his mischief, of his incorrect behavior, that it changed the standards of man. It changed the way in which he was oriented. Did the ship sink? No, not necessarily. It led to new creative outlets. It caused one of the greatest empires that the world has ever known to be brought forth. It created a lot of turbulence, though, a lot of potential for the crossing of certain boundaries that might be detrimental to a society. More in terms of its extension, I think, rather than its inception. However, as we consider this, as we consider the type of character like Martin Luther, we can imagine a situation in which something may be set in motion that may occur over the span of many hundreds of years that is difficult to tell the exact effect that one's mischief had caused or it led to. Mischief may be seen in the eyes of some to be misplaced or incorrect behavior, and by the standards of others that may be acceptable behavior. So I think this speaks to the dynamism of human will, the adaptability of human will, the multiple paths that man can take to experience and to facilitate his growth and prosperity, but also to the degree that he is incapable of seeing all the potential consequences of his actions. Now, if we move away from the Lutheran example, and we move more into something that is more deliberate, that someone perhaps is seeing, much like I mentioned before about the whole and the aspects, that somebody is seeing the whole of human civilization on this ship. And they are going through and examining the aspects. They are examining both the physical structure, the weaknesses for which they might be able to drill certain holes to eventually lead to the sinking of the ship, the breaking of those fundamental boundaries or taboos. And they may also be interweaving themselves into different relationships with people. Perhaps they want to keep the ship afloat enough so that they can prop themselves up. And this is sort of the second interpretation of the word mischief, that the chief is incorrectly ordained, that the evil person, by his heart studying this destruction, by understanding the component parts for evil purposes perhaps, but in this case he is examining the standards and restrictions, the boundaries, the liberties of human will by necessarily respecting the constraints of the ship of God's will, so that he may be falsely propped up, because he folds over the eyes of man such that they think him to be a good leader, perhaps a good chief, a good head, the good thinking aspect, the caudal, or rather the cranial aspect that contains the driving creative force. But in reality, this is the person for whom his heart studies destruction, and their lips talk of mischief. So he is a false head. He is the head that would see the aspects consumed in himself, so that what is recognized is himself, rather than the whole, recognizing the whole that he is a part of. Again, that is the ship, that is the potential for human civilization. Through wisdom is an house built, and by understanding it is established. So I'd like to say that today is a new day before I get into this verse. And perhaps a few words to get my mind warmed up may be useful here. You know, it's funny beginning one of these on a new day. Sometimes it's just best to go right into the verse and not really say much of the time that has elapsed. Other times the mind seems a bit eager to share what it is holding, almost like a vessel of water that is full to the brim, and perhaps the vessel cannot or can no longer hold the weight of the water within it, and it just sort of bursts out because of the pressure. And I'm not sure that I have anything particularly profound or interesting to say, but rather that of life and of experience of my living, just in the general sense. I have to say that today I'm thankful. I'm thankful for what I have. I'm thankful for what I do. I'm thankful for the opportunity to be able to express my thoughts into this microphone, to express and to learn and to grow from the Bible that's in front of me. I'm thankful that over the years, and more so recently, that I have come to differentiate different modes of approaching my mind, of focusing my attention. And although it is far from perfect, I'm thankful that it is moving towards what I'm hoping to build as some idea of goodness. I feel as though that I am getting closer to that divine nature, that divine spirit. At times I have felt a strong pull in the opposite direction. It almost seems the harder I push in the good direction, the harder the pull is in the opposite direction, but it seems to be a fleeting thing, a temporary thing. Upon every new horizon, with every new outlook on the landscape, there comes a period of trouble, of disorientation. One's gaze must be redirected, reoriented to that which is truly meaningful upon that vast array in that landscape. And what is most meaningful is difficult to determine. Often it is subtle. It requires patience and discipline, but it is there. It is there, and it is sustaining. So I've always liked these types of verses. The general theme of the verse we've seen before. There's another word that I wanted to use there. The word motif comes to mind. This is the word that I was thinking of. That this is something of a pattern that we have seen before. Like with many verses, there are various levels, degrees of interrelatedness. Some verses are quite obvious that they have been repeated before, perhaps not in exact language, but something somewhat similar. And every time we come around to these verses again, it's an opportunity to explore anew, either take a similar path and to expand on it, or some entirely new path. That's sort of the beauty of the Proverbs. It leaves a lot open to the mind to explore and to build. Now, I remember this motif early on in the Proverbs. I think it's been repeated a few times since. Through wisdom is an house built, and by understanding is it established. So I'm going to start with the first half of this verse. I don't want to speak too soon, but I think that this one might be a longer one to explore. I would like it to be a longer one. You know, the concept of wisdom and understanding, sometimes it's frustrating because what we're given is so little. We have to draw these really large inferences about information that is sparsely connected. You know, I think about the meniscus in the knee, the sort of articular tissue that provides cushion for the femur as it rests on the tibia. And I think about all the situations in which a person can disrupt this tissue, and then all the situations in which somebody would deal with the idea that this tissue is torn, and then the questions that follow: does it heal? How long does it take? And I think about general capacity given certain constraints. And I think about the mind. I think about how readily adaptable we are in many different situations, and then seemingly in these types of situations, as I've described with the knee, it just seems like there are things that can take us out so simply and nag us for such a long time, and really have no positive or strong, desirable, perhaps, solution to the problem. And there's such a finality to the reality of certain situations of an orthopedic context. And I think of the more in a physiological sense, the sparseness, the scarcity of cells that are within the area that would then provide and interact to such a degree that would be sufficient to heal the tissue. They're so dispersed throughout that tissue that that type of interaction is just not going to happen in most cases. That type of interaction meaning healing. And now I say that not necessarily as an explicit reference to the content of this verse, but rather the general theme of the verse, or maybe of the Proverbs in general. It's not always the case, but there is this thematic element that we see, that we are prompted to consider things. We're given something that is a bit vague, but also quite directing. Given a blank slate, it is very directing. But when we are getting down into the particulars, when we are differentiating between knowledge and wisdom, when we are differentiating between the fool, the wicked, and the evil, when we are determining what is good versus what is bad, what is just, what is righteous, all of these sorts of things, we are not given clear definitions. And I think that is by design, but we are directed on the road towards the definition. The definition is something that we come to, I think, on our own. Certainly we can be given declaratives, we can be given instructions, explicit direction to do this and not do that. We've had a lot of that, earlier on in the Bible, in the Book of Law, and all this, sort of thing. But here, we are asked to be a participant. We are asked to be more of a facilitator of the heavenly principles, to come to our own understanding, not necessarily our own truth, but come to truth in our own way, and to see it with eyes from the perspective that our being and our existence affords us. And our perspective is inflated or filled with our experiences, our concrete, physical substructure, the way in which our neurons are organized, perhaps the way in which we respond to stimuli, how we are tuned in more plain language. And so considering that, sort of a somewhat of a frustration, somewhat of a reflection on where we are, or where my mind is when moving into this, but I don't want to say that it's just a frustration. It is more of an observation. It is something that I'm aware that I must accept the responsibility that is being asked of me when I am to interpret this verse. And before I get into it, the remaining thing that I would have to say is regarding the analogy that I used with the meniscus. Even though in that story, in that situation, it's often the case that there's a situation of reality bites in which the tissue may not heal. I don't mean to draw a direct analogy to the Proverbs. I don't mean to say that just because there is a similarity of scarceness of precision, that precision or resolution is not possible. I certainly think it is, and I certainly think that we've had plenty of resolution here throughout these episodes. So I want to make that qualifying statement about that analogy. Through wisdom is an house built. So, we're going to have to paint a picture here. We're going to have to imagine a landscape. That's the only way I think that my mind is capable of understanding this sort of thing. And in the process of doing, I'll check the Google definition. Maybe I'll check etymological chain. Who knows? We'll see where the path leads us. Through wisdom is an house built. So let's start quite simply and plainly. Make the distinction that what is being referred to here, the house, is probably not a simple physical structure, although it may have some physical orientation in the world. What is being referred to here is more than just the physical thing. It is more than just, if I was to imagine a house or the building that I'm sitting in here. I live in a sort of an apartment building, but regardless, the principle is the same. It's built up of similar materials. Behind these walls, I would find wood, I would find metal, I would find many different aspects that produce the structural, physical object that is this building, or that is this place that I call my home. Now, within that distinction, within that characterization, there's only so much, I think, that we can say. There are different ways in which a physical object can be designed or organized. There are different purposes and functions for which we can design buildings. Not all buildings are designed to facilitate living. And I would argue even some buildings these days that are designed for living probably ought not to be designated as such because they're so poorly designed. And perhaps I should back up a little bit. I think I may have jumped the gun when I started to speak of purposes. Because the physical object, or rather the physical materials that are necessary to make up the building, it would seem that every step of the way we are involved in bringing this heavenly principle, or the meaning or purposeful principle, the directed principle, down into it, to elevate it from its material circumstance. Now, I think that there are some arguments to be had here, especially in the case of wood, because it comes from an organic source, unlike the metal or the iron that's in this building. But let's say, just for the sake of argument, that if we take a bunch of inanimate objects and we design or we put some effort into directing their purpose to facilitate our needs or our desires, the point at which we interact or use these objects for our own purposes and our own desires, I think that there is a separation there from that of the physical underlying base substrate. And I say that because the base substrate, the physical object, has yet to be touched by this experience. It has yet to be touched by the creative element. It has yet to be touched by the creative element that is within man. Of course, it is, in a broader, general sense, it has the creative element because it exists. If it didn't have the creative element, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be a created thing. It wouldn't be an object that is. And I would like to say at this point that although we are talking about this in the context of a divine logos, some center point of intelligibility that bears responsibility for creation or for the creative element, I want to put aside much of those distinctions and qualities, the way in which that can be, and I don't want to get too lost in the language of creation, because regardless of whether or not I myself believe that there is something else out there that was the generative element, the element that set in motion perceivable reality, I will say that regardless of that situation, we have this perceivable reality, and since we have it, I will speak in the terms of creation. And I think that I'm sort of pandering to my own the reason that wishes to come in to interject. Well, you have to go through a lot of logical steps in order to come to this creator. You're making an assumption before you move forward. But I think that we don't really have to make too large of an assumption to speak in this type of language. Regardless if one believes that there is the generative element or not. The concept of creation, or generally the concept of that which is, stands, I think, in and of itself. through wisdom is an house built. Okay, so I've talked about the physical structure of the house. I've talked about how this is the elements, the components that make it up, are different from the purposeful, meaningful, valuable component from a human perspective that has gone into the creation of this building, the creation on top of creation. So now the house both includes its physical form and its geographic identity, but also something more, something purposeful, meaningful. It occupies a particular position. It will satisfy certain needs or desires, wishes, whatever. It will serve to facilitate the growth of family, the expansion of business, whatever it might be. Now I'd like to pause here for a second. We have a few different things to play with. I mentioned that I was going to paint a picture, and it's a bit difficult to do so. But the image that I see is this principle, a fundamental principle that I have been calling creation. It's a generative principle. It's a principle that allows for, that takes into consideration the existence of a thing, existence in general, thingness. It allows for, because of that base reality, regardless of how something comes to understand it, it allows for successive iteration. And by that I mean that on top of it, on top of that which is, language here is difficult for me, but I may want to use the word complexity. But at the same time, I find in my mind situations where complexity is not the right word. Progression, elevation seems to be a good word. The moving towards something, towards some peak. Divine Logos comes to mind, unity comes to mind, directedness comes to mind. I see, in front of me, I see this vast network of potential qualities that unify things together, that make them identifiable, that allow for thingness to be. I see certain things possibly connecting to other things to produce something that is more than the base original substrate, as in the case of the physical elements of the house versus the concept or the idea of the house. The merging of these two create this new physical object that would otherwise not necessarily exist. It has undergone the creative process by different means than what we consider to be, or at least what I consider to be, the base level. I think of the universe, I think of space, I think of time, I think of probability. All of these different factors have come into play to determine the formation of stars, the formation of solid rocky bodies, one of which, of course, is our own home, the Earth. I think of the time it took to create galaxies and what we consider to be the universe in general. Just the general vastness of man's reality, I guess we can say. His home is in some sense the universe. It's also the earth. But it's the it's the intelligible aspect of that reality that is really his home. Because he can imagine, he can perceive, he can intuit, he can project. Now there's a lot there, and I think that there is a degree of the vague that I've brought into my image of what I'm trying to convey. But I do believe that it's getting a little bit more precise, bit by bit. These are very large concepts, and I don't want to lose sight of that. I want to continue on this path and to continue to chip down or chip away at this. So this distinction now, or rather I should say the relationship, that the base reality, and I'm considering base reality as something that is independent of human thought, and elevated reality is more of my narcissistic view of the purposeful introduction of man's heart into this situation. Not that a house is particularly reality-shattering or universe-altering, but it is an interesting phenomenon to consider and to reflect on, given our general view and understanding of all of the potential earthly bodies that exist within our galaxy, and our general cultural view that although we have these reports of alien sightings and these fanciful ideas of alien civilizations, there's a general undercurrent that many of us tend to believe that we are alone, or at least because we don't have concrete evidence, that we don't like to think too fancifully to get carried away. And by this narrative that we tell ourselves, there is this melancholy of loneliness that comes with it, and a longing for connection to other levels, other layers, in which the world that we find ourselves in becomes different to us, a larger purpose, a larger creative element finds its home upon our both physical but also conscious landscape. I think here of the potential for artificial intelligence to emerge from that. And given that we are on this verge, on the eve of this artificial intelligence revolution, perhaps that I can say that we are in it. Just yesterday, I believe, or the day before, we had the release of a new GPT model. It's GPT-4 with a little O. I don't remember exactly the language that is used to describe what this character is, but something that is free to the world, that is an update from the prior language model. It's fairly interesting. In this year, 2024, we seem to be progressing towards something fascinating. But again, I say that to say that from where we've come, we can see, and for where we have to go, I think we can project. Within reason, of course. But by thought experiment and reflection that is prompted by this verse, I believe that we have to have an image of this broader sense, or bigger picture, in order to understand and conceptualize what is meant by through wisdom and house is built. So now it comes into question, outside of the physical, and diving into the more detailed, purposeful. It could be asked, for what reason do we design the house? There are plenty of obvious answers like shelter, safety, comfort. There are more sophisticated answers, like raising a family, facilitating relationships, love. And given this probabilistic projective capacity that we have, especially when reflecting on this sort of thing, and also bringing into the mind that what I had mentioned ever so ineloquently about the universe and about all of the different interactions between material objects that have produced different forms and different scales of forms and different composition of forms. And again, how this relates to our own conception of time, how it relates with the interface, our level of consciousness, how it relates to, how it interfaces with the grandness of that whole story, at least as we understand it to be. And moving into something that is a little bit more intuitive, but again follows the same motif, is we find of this variability of creation, we find it within the establishment, or in the establishing of a house. That we can just as easily imagine that a house or a home is occupied by a hermit, by a lonely alcoholic, by a hard-working businesswoman, by a couple madly in love, by a family strongly devoted to one another and to their community, of a family that is highly dysfunctional, foolish, perhaps wicked, of those that occupy homes that terrorize their communities, that take more than they give, that feel themselves more important than they really are. There are many different people that occupy these physical structures that we call houses. And certainly I think it could be said that every individual, in the way in which they participate in the world, has something to do with the house that they occupy, or has some relationship to the house that they occupy. For it's often the case that when a person moves into a house, a no insignificant purchase, a major life event, necessarily there is concern and there is interest about who is living close to one another. Some communities more than others, I think, are interested in being close to one another. But all the same, many communities have those that have an understanding or an idea of people, of the various people that occupy the houses on a particular street. And I think in reference, what is interesting, we often use the language, that house. And then the house is, of course, not the physical house that we are pointing to. Of course, we could be pointing to it to identify some physical quality of it, but usually when we refer to a house, we're referring to the general experience of the people that live there and how it relates to our experience. The house takes on, much like the artificial intelligence example, a layer of creation that sits on top of our own generative capacity. And so the house, or the home, as it is embedded in the community, I think occupies a space almost like a tool, or a somewhat powerful technology. A tool that can be used rightly or wrongly. We can imagine a hammer either being used rightly or wrongly. And since I'm considering the house to be a type of technology, perhaps an amplifier to man's creative or generative capacities, it would seem that it would be prudent, it would be wise, just as it is, and there is much difference between it is wise for a master or a journeyman carpenter, for example, to wield the tools of their craft versus a novice. The type or the way in which they interact with their tools is different. Partly it's because of learned experience. That learned experience affords them different ways of going about doing things. Within the difference, I think there lies a particular approach to truth, which I think is so valued in people that are experienced and learned in any one particular pursuit. And it is the desire of the novice to obtain a certain level of sophistication, such that they are able to wield the tools more effectively to produce better outcomes. And then the question is, well, what is a better outcome? What should we desire to produce? And I think that there are many qualities. There are many qualities in which man may take for himself to produce something. At the end of it, much like I've made a critique earlier on, a few minutes ago, about the potential that a builder has for producing a building that is designed to inhabit people to live in, and yet there's something about the design that just it doesn't cut it. It doesn't meet some standard by which I or somebody else may have for a reasonable or desirable living space. And so at this point, I would have to say that the way in which one utilizes the tool or establishes the house is through their understanding of the tools necessary to produce the house, or the purposes that are involved in designing the house. And I want to get away from more superficial elements, and I think beauty is quite important. So, structurally, a house, I think, should be beautiful. The place that it rests in should be manicured. It should be something that facilitates the human mind and growth. I think that all goes into it. But at this point, I want to reflect a little bit more just on the qualities that the person must have in order to even approach designing the house or inhabiting the house. I think these are two different paths, especially these days, where it's not often that you have a person that designs and then lives in the house. It's more so a person that picks a house and lives in it. And to my estimation, and this is going to be at least something to get us started, it is, as the verse says, it is through wisdom that house is established. And I've already said that what's necessary to produce something good is effective utilization of the tools that are required to produce that desired end or outcome. So all of these words to move the needle just very little. So let's recap here a little bit. We've come to the understanding that the house is conceptual. It is more than its physical properties. It is something that contains almost an air, an aura, an expansive quality to it that can extend into the people that inhabit it, that require that relationship with individuals to produce this active, dynamic concept that we have, that we consider to be the house. And then we have the understanding of the tool, both in terms of the proficiency of one that chooses or decides to build a house, and everything that means, because that is directed in and of itself, even if they don't decide to live there, and it's just sort of an occupation for them to do so. There is a purposeful, meaningful direction that goes into building a home. Once the home is built and it is inhabited, then there is further use of tools, perhaps different tools, not the tools of a carpenter, but the tools of a person living their life. And I suppose we can reflect, we can ask ourselves the question, on the utility belt of an everyday person, or a person who owns a home, what tools do they have to build that house, to extend it into something that is truly meaningful, and to make it into a space that is enjoyable and inhabitable? And we come back to wisdom. We say through wisdom, the house is built. Now we can go back to the physical analogy, and we could say, by what means, through what, is the physical structure of the house built? We could say that it is built through the expenditure of energy, perhaps. We could say that it is built through the transfer of meaningful labor, skillful labor, from potential to action, to result. We can again say that it is through wisdom that the physical house is built. But that doesn't tell us much of what wisdom is. But of a house, both its physical nature and its conceptual nature, we have components. We have components that must be organized in a particular way for it to be a house. So I think the physical is very, since it's a visual example and it's tangible, I think it's easier to conceptualize in my mind than the more ethereal, fluid concept that is the inhabitable house and the creation of family and of those bonds. Although those bonds can be felt, it's much more difficult to see them in a physical sense, or to touch them. But we will get there in a moment. So this physical house, the physical structure, it requires different elements, organized in different ways. I think we can all agree that at least of the cultural standard, there will be structures that are built, that can be built, that would not really be considered a house. Man can erect a telephone pole or a flagpole, for example, and we would not readily mistake these structures for a house. Although there are different aspects to these objects, they are not organized in such a way that it would make it identifiable as a house. Now, this is not to say that there are not many ways in which different things can be organized to make or to produce something that is considered to be a house. But all the same, this concept of identification and of identity is important. And of identity, to reiterate, we have the components, we have the aspects that make it up. But we also have the aggregate. We have all of the components together in the particular way that they are organized. So the components matter, and the result matters, the way in which they are added together. So both of these concepts are fundamental to producing some identity. I think this analogy extends into the broader concept that is the house, that is more than the physical components or parts. That when the person moves into the house, there is the aspectual and there is the overall aggregate experience of habitation. Now, because we have these things in common, the aspectual and the global, or the aggregate, the whole, the identity, if we say by what means, through what, that is a big question. And if we go through something, what does it mean? Well, if I want to transition to any particular place, let's say I want to go from my room to the kitchen, I have to go through something. I have to move across a certain boundary or barrier. For it is not the case that my room is necessarily my kitchen, even though I am within the same apartment. Now, I suppose there are situations in which one's room can be in a kitchen. When I was in graduate school, I lived in an apartment that was in a loft on top of somebody's garage, and it had a full kitchen in it, had a sink and a bathroom. But the thing about this place, it was a very small apartment. The bed was right next to the front door. And then about 3 feet away from the bed was the refrigerator. A couple of feet away from the refrigerator was the rest of the kitchen, with the sink and the oven, the microwave on top of the oven. And then on the other side was the living room, but it was all one room. It was continuous. Now this is, I suppose, it's not necessary to bring this example up, but I think it's kind of interesting to think about the blurring of all of these different components into one room. I found myself when I was living there that even though this was one room outside of the bathroom was sort of like in a closet, it would seem, a small place. Had a shower in it, a sink and a toilet. But I would not spend all of my time on the bed. For productive things, I would sit in a chair or on the couch that was in the same room, and I would do my work there. The bed was for sleeping. I wouldn't eat in my bed. I wouldn't eat on the couch. There was a small table right next to the front door. The door would barely open because of the space, the front door, I should say. And I would eat at this table because there were different places for different purposes. Again, regardless of being in one room. So what ended up happening, even though there were no physical boundaries there, boundaries were created in my mind. Now, that's not to say that I couldn't do everything on the bed or everything on the couch. But eventually, regardless of how we organize ourselves as a culture and a society and how we view space, these things will emerge. Now, to go back to what I was talking about here, what it means to go through something. Again, I just described this example of going through a doorway from my bedroom into the kitchen. I have crossed some threshold, one identity to the next, and there are different components of each identity that would allow me to identify that this room is a bedroom. This is a place for a different purpose, designed for a different purpose than the kitchen. We may blur the lines a little bit across different people inhabit their homes a bit differently. I, for example, eat my food in my room at my desk. I don't eat it at the counter, which might be strange to some people. But I don't eat my food on my bed. I would find that strange, and perhaps there are some people that do so. Regardless of where we find this boundary or the transitional space between one part, one space and another, one identity and another, we can say that they exist, and we can say that we move through them. And in this sense, when we reflect on what it means to move through or between identities, what it means is we are experiencing, in my estimation, the two components that I had mentioned earlier, both the aspectual, that produces the components that are organized in such a way to produce the identity, but also the overall whole that the components make, that centerpiece of identity that is not necessary to understand every single little piece of a room to understand what it's for. We can identify a kitchen based on basic elements. We don't have to tear down the walls. We don't have to rip the sink apart. We don't have to find the gas line. Now, of course, if we are building something, that sort of thing comes into play, because we have to organize the aspects. But if something is there as an identity, we can take a different approach, more of a holistic approach. So moving between these two identities, largely in this context, in this analogy, we're moving at the top level. We're looking top down at the identity rather than bottom up. Now, I think the observation is one thing. When we say through wisdom, I'm not sure it exactly correlates to moving from one identity to another. But I think it does relate to the way in which we see identity. And I think the very process of seeing identity is this throughness that we're talking about. Because we are seeing through a conceptual framework. The framework is that wisdom. The better we are able to identify something and its purpose, the better we are at producing some purposeful end, or to create a stronger identity, because we understand that identities are made of component parts, and at the top, the component parts, as they're organized together, produce a different structure or form. And it is through this process of binding different things together and organizing things in different ways and examining from the top down the result of this organization that we build what we consider to be a house, both in its physical form, but also more of the conceptual. The conceptual encompasses the physical, but also the aspect of the habitable experience. And of the habitable experience, there are so many different options. Just as there are many options of the way in which one can organize material objects to produce the house. Within a house, there might be different types of relationships. It might be a multifamily home. There might be no families in the house. It might just be a roommate type situation. It might be one person living in the house. It might be one person and 4 animals. So this is a thought, I suppose, that I have never had before, or perhaps I may have had it and I forgot it. But from what I remember of the previous patterns, this is a little bit different. I think I've explored the analogy of the house before in this way, but the conceptualization of wisdom as more of a lens through which you see identity, this might be a little bit different, a little bit novel for me. And I think there's a little bit more here than just seeing identity. But all the same, the second half of the verse comes through here, because it's the second half of the verse is, and by understanding it is established. So there's a conflict that is arising within me. And the question is wisdom to be interpreted as something that is fundamental, but all the same, perhaps basic, that it requires this understanding in order for what? Well, this word established is interesting. For what does it mean for something to be established? If I say that I am established, that I am fixed in life, I am fixed to something, I'm fixed to a purpose, I have a reason for what I do, there is some consistency within my life, some regular pattern of behavior. Further, I think it also implies that I have achieved a level or degree of what we would call success, in the sense that my establishment has given me roots to my geographical location, but also as a parallel to the physical and the conceptual, as I've described with the example of the house. Culturally or locally in my life, I am connected to different people. I'm connected to a corporation. I am embedded within a particular structure, system. And it is my embeddedness that affords a lot of articulation. It affords my ability to accumulate money, for example. It gives me roots in the conscious sphere and the physical. So this concept of establishment and the illustration of rootedness, much like a tree grows its roots into the ground, I think the larger the tree becomes, the more established the roots are. The roots grow farther, they grow larger, and the tree on the surface is larger. Much is the parallel, I think, between my life and the roots of my behavior, the roots of my efforts and my attention. As that grows, as my attention grows towards something, towards my one behavior, so too does everything else on the surface. Now, another thing about this word established, the definition of it is having been in existence for a long time and therefore recognized and generally accepted. Some similar words are accepted, traditional, orthodox, habitual, confirmed, entrenched. And it would seem that wisdom and understanding have an overlap to them. Much like we can say of identity that my room and the kitchen are both rooms, but they functionally serve different purposes. That it would seem that wisdom involves an aspect of seeing through. So we see through wisdom, but through wisdom we see the connections between the aspects, the fundamental meaningful component of putting one thing along with another to produce something in the future, or something that we can interact with. It's a way of seeing binding. But this matter of establishment and considering that time is an aspect of it, let's try our best to use our definition of the word wisdom and to utilize this tool that is wisdom to look through it, to understand what establishment means. If we are to say for a moment the aspectual, we have this term, we have the dimension of time, we have the dimension of attention. That dimension of attention splinters out into plenty of different things that forms connections with people, with institutions. We have the concept, the analogy to that of the tree. Again, time is a dimension here. As the roots grow, it takes time. But also there is the quality of the root. It is the size of the root as it relates to the size of the tree. That if we remove the dimension of time, it almost seems to be impossible given the way in which we interface with the world, but if we remove it, we might be able to focus a little bit better on different aspects or different dimensions for a moment. And again, in the spirit of wisdom, the reason that we do this is not, I think, to discount the importance of time, but rather to see more and then to reintroduce so that we can understand why and how things might be related. So let's go back to the analogy of the tree. If we are to take the size of the root, what does the size of the root depend on? We can say what causes the size of the root, or what influences the size of the root, other than time. Now, I don't want to get lost in the concept of time, and as it relates to our experience, but the more that I think about it, I think the less valuable in some broader sense that it seems. Of course, it's valuable to our experience. But independent of this time, the size of the root depends on the nutrients that it receives. Putting aside the species of tree and ultimately the size of that the tree can grow, let's just say it's an oak tree or an elm tree, one of these larger trees. I think there's an analogy here to be had between man and a tree of this size, because man has capacity to grow and to grow his roots deep within the conceptual and physical spheres. But again, the size of the root depends on the nutrients that it gets. It depends on the location of the tree. It depends on the day-to-day interactions that the tree has with the environment. It depends on the effectiveness of the internal organism, but also the ability to adapt to the, I want to say outside world, but the broader interactive environment. We can say it's outside of the tree, or we can just say that the tree and the environment interact in this sort of fluid manner. And so the roots depend on all of this, despite time. Of course, time is an element to us, and perhaps to the tree as well, because they are finite beings. And so if we zoom out a little bit and we think about how exactly a house comes to be established or planted firm or have a large size, not necessarily physically, but of course, like we've seen, this physical dimension, we can explore that, but also explore the meaningful domain, the conscious domain, which is sort of what in my mind, I'm really interested in. How do we grow that meaningful sphere? The size of the house is great and everything, but just like the tree, and the root of the tree grows by its relationship to the environment, by the quality of the nutrients that it takes in, I think so too does the internal structure of the house. The way in which the inhabitants interact with the physical structure, but also with the external environment, what they bring into the house, what they take from the house out into the world, the discipline, the practices that they have within the home, the types of things that they do when nobody is watching. Certainly a tree would not grow very large if the cells were aware that there was some broader organism that was looking at it. Or perhaps I should say, the cells would not do very well if they had such a conception of themselves and such a selfish desire for self-satisfaction that they didn't take into consideration the broader whole that they were a part of, and instead of optimizing themselves for growth and proliferation, they decided to be internal and perhaps productive in terms of the whole for only their own selfish reasons, to take from the whole, to secure their existence. I think it would be reasonable to expect that the roots of the tree would not grow very large, or at least they would be limited by the way in which the cells behave relative to a tree in which the cells were more harmonious with the whole. And we're continuing to put out into the world their best effort and to fulfill the purposes that they have been set forth to fulfill. And so in this way, I think a person, a family, whatever structure occupies the home, I think they must articulate in this manner. There must be a harmony there. There must be some purpose, some responsibility that is accepted, and that purpose and responsibility must be acted out. The cells must do their job in order for growth and proliferation to occur. The person or people within a home must occupy their roles in order and occupy them well, right? Not to sort of occupy them here and there to get by. For what purpose? We're just occupying the roles to get by, to satisfy the self. That doesn't really make sense. The self is certainly important, but the self exists to occupy the role. Otherwise, it's an internal feedback loop, a nightmare of self-gratification, of appealing to base desires. So I think the understanding comes in when one begins to identify through wisdom the elements, the components that are necessary to produce the large root in the example of the tree, or to produce the individual that is effective at fulfilling his role, whether it be the family, the father figure in the family, or if it's just, let's say, a single person in a home, it could be the satisfaction of their occupation or of their roles, of their role to their friends and to their family members. It is about getting the necessary spiritual nutrients and also facilitating the proper organization of those nutrients to facilitate and to grow something, right? This is the pursuit of understanding. Well, what are we trying to grow in the house? Are we trying to grow selfish desire? No, probably not. Are we trying to fulfill the self's desire? To a degree, yes. Are we trying to integrate the self into some broader whole? Yes, I think so. And the self's role then is to facilitate the growth of that broader whole, of that unity. Because here now we are the aspects that are participating in a society, a collective, much like the wood components in the house form the frame, and the different structural components support the house as it stands, such that a family can occupy it. And the family in the house is there to facilitate, to occupy the higher level, which is perhaps the community level. And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So here we have the third. We talked about wisdom, we talked about understanding, and here we have knowledge. Okay, so I should mention that today is a new day. It is a Thursday today. Thankfully, tomorrow is a Friday. The week is coming to a close. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how I spend my time on the weekends. I have a good amount of free time. I have some work on the weekends that I do in the mornings, but in the afternoons, I generally have time to myself. And in these moments, I have to wonder. I have to wonder about the cost of the week on my stamina, on my strength. These are themes that will come up in the next verse, but there is a relationship here to my experience and the verses that I have been discussing. And how could it not, obviously? talking about something as important and as large as a concept as wisdom. An aspect of seeing, or a way of seeing the aspects, seeing the whole, not getting lost in either, but being disciplined, patient. And I think lately I've failed on the weekends, or just generally when I have free time, to spend it as productively as possible. And perhaps because in my mind there is this struggle between self-satisfaction or desire and the fulfillment of that. And what else? When I am forced, perhaps, maybe that's not the right term to use, but when I am engaged, when I am turned on, so to speak, in the sense that my mind understands that it must go through the struggle of the week. On Monday, I am not, even though I may feel contrary, I will not give myself an excuse to put down that which is important and to do nothing because I don't have the option to do it. And so perhaps there is something there, this aspect of the option. And it's quite easy, I think, to get lost in the aspects for the desire to see the whole. That throughout my working life, there is a lot of, there's thought, there's a lot of communication, there's effort, plus there is the devotion to other things like fitness and the Bible, or important literature more generally. And balancing all of this and more, of course, my relationships with people that are close to me, balancing all of this can be daunting. And what I'm working on now is to be as productive as possible. The question is, well, how does one be as productive as possible? What is the best use of time? Well, it's almost easier to identify the poor uses of time because I find myself often after a long week engaging in them, giving myself the excuse to engage in them, perhaps for fear of burnout. The term precious and pleasant riches comes to mind in this verse. How differently we can see what these precious and pleasant riches are. For we can say that free time, devotion to one's own personal desires is precious and pleasant. We can say of more of an economic example of people that use their monies for different services. Some for alcohol, some for books. There are many ways in which we can devote our attention, or devote the earned potential of our attention. Some of it, I think, is admittedly difficult to say one way or another if it is beneficial, or if it can be considered productive. But I do not wish to make the case that these precious and pleasant riches are subjective. While they may be different for different people, they are not different for different people because of the selfish component. And when I say the selfish component, I don't necessarily mean that the self is not important and involved and related to these pleasant and precious riches. Rather, it is the way in which it is related. This aspect of wisdom and understanding the relatedness comes in here. The ability to observe and to see it for what it is, but also to understand. To understand that if one component is related to another in such a way that there is a particular result, there is adequate identity formation, in other words. But this really doesn't explain much. It doesn't say anything of the identity. All I've said is that it is adequate. Well, adequate relative to what? I'd like to put that aside for a moment, and I'd like to talk about the word chambers. Now, I have looked up the word chamber, and I have two seemingly opposing definitions. One is a large room used for formal or public events. And then the second, in the archaic, a private room, especially a bedroom. One public and then one private in terms of these definitions. I think what the definition that I would like to use is private chambers. I think it could just as easily be public chambers, but just for the sake of exploration, let's imagine a private chambers. And by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So what can we say of this chamber? A room. I spent a good amount of time talking about the house and the rooms that are in the house. Here it seems that we are thinking about the house or the home on a level that is a little bit more detailed. It's a little bit more zoomed in. The specific room now. By knowledge, it would seem that wisdom is a broad concept. It's not a simple one, but it includes many different pieces of information. As I've said, at this point I'm conceptualizing it as a way in which we see, a way in which we perceive, take in information. It is our ability to intuit the whole, but recognize the aspects. It is not limited to that. I think that there is a degree also within wisdom, understanding, that is the recognition of the relatedness of component parts and of component parts to the whole. Understanding seems to be wisdom, a part of wisdom, but just a zoomed-in component. Now, knowledge, I think, is yet an even more zoomed-in component. I think there's a practical element to knowledge. But of knowledge, it includes my definition of understanding, and it is also a part of my definition of my definition of wisdom, of the word wisdom. And so the image of the Russian doll comes back to me again. That wisdom is the large portion of that Russian doll. Inside of that, the next layer down is understanding. The next layer down is knowledge. All are born of this larger doll that is wisdom. All contain similar characteristics and components, but they differ in terms of scale. Now, I'm not necessarily sure that I would like to reduce these terms to purely scalar, that understanding is a subset of wisdom and knowledge is a subset of understanding, which is a subset of wisdom. But there is a certain way in which I find this to be true following these verses. Through wisdom the house is built. Understanding has established it. Knowledge fills the chambers. The chambers are a specific room in the house. So it would just seem, by the way that we are being directed and prompted here, that this is the path to go down. So let's broaden our picture, or our initial conception, our initial illustration of this house. Now, I am somebody that likes to repeat myself, so I may go into this in a particular detail. It may be a bit nauseating to those who may stumble upon this. So, what we have so far is a projection of mind. The house is a good example, an analogy. The verse uses the house. The house itself, we can imagine, as something of a concept grounded in the physical world. The concept is something that almost of its physical form radiates elements of existence that are perceivable and yet exist on different planes. I could say dimension, one in the conscious dimension, one in more of the physical dimension. We can perhaps qualify this by placing a marker, by saying maybe this is a degree of freedom in terms of the way in which we experience the world. Now, I understand degrees of freedom have different meanings depending on the discipline, like engineering versus anatomy. But if I may come up with my own categories for a moment, just so that I can have some place to rest my mind, such that we can further this illustration, I think that would be best and appropriate. So, the place we have to move into is to consider and to reflect on what this room means to the broader picture, the broader concept of the house. And we don't necessarily have to limit ourselves to the example of the house, but we have to have ourselves grounded. So I want to say that so we can understand the possibility of continued exploration outside of the analogy, but also we are going to remain grounded within this analogy because it's where we are most familiar. This is where we began, and so we have to come home to something. Okay, so considering the house and its physical anchoring, and then its broader conceptual role, what role then does a particular room play? Now, one room, I've discussed this already, versus another may have different functions, it may have different purposes. A bathroom is not the same as a bedroom. A kitchen is not the same as a bedroom or a closet. and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled. So if we imagine bare bones, a room, we can go back to the basics. Maybe the house doesn't have a physical structure yet, and we are just planning on building a house. It would be written down, it would be planned out, that the house would have different sections, different areas. And even before its physical existence, we would know that the structure that is to be will have a place in it for which we rest our heads, where we are probably going to place a nice soft surface that is comforting for us, that we would be safe in. In our rooms we may have, I guess this depends on the individual, but in our rooms we may have quite intimate material. It may be material related to our personal finances. It may be things that are materially valuable. We may have a safe full of money. In my situation, I have a lot of books on bookshelves. I have a desk. I have a computer on my desk. I'm in my bedroom right now. In fact, I'm talking into this microphone. I'm looking at this Bible. This whole experience takes place in this room. And so this room, I think, for me, takes on a bigger meaning than just a place where I come to rest my head. Important as though it may be. Also in my room, I have things that are attached to the walls. I have a couple of paintings. I have an image, a picture. I have more of a scientific, I guess it's not a painting, but it's an image and it's framed on my wall. I have a rug, a carpet, a couple of musical instruments, different things to give the room some color. And yet, all of these objects, they do have some significance, some more than others. But it's not just within the material aspect of these things that make them precious and pleasant. The paintings that I have on my wall, one of them really has no bearing on much of anything, other than that it's just there to have something to fill the space, to give it some artistic flavor. But just like many things with cuisine that seem to add flavor, it doesn't seem to do much for us at the fundamental level, in terms of providing us with vitamins and minerals and the proteins that are necessary to sustain us. It is more just a superficial, desire-satisfying element. And there's another image that is on my wall that is not that way, that it has something to do with where my attention goes on a regular basis, more of a professional illustration. And so, although these two things are both material objects, they hold different weights in terms of value. And since we are talking about knowledge filling the chamber with precious and pleasant things, and since these precious and pleasant things perhaps require some physical, material basis for them to have some relatedness to us, because this is how we experience the world, and of course also in this conscious domain, which I wish to shortly make that connection. But it is the case that because of this relationship, and I think that this is, wisdom and understanding flows through here, even though knowledge, as I've said, seems to imply on this smaller scale, it has the larger elements within it. And so we can imagine this understanding and wisdom shooting our mind up and out of just this local chamber into broader principles or concepts. And there's something, I think, significant with the example that I've given between the image or the painting that really doesn't mean much and it's just there for decoration, it's flavor for the room. And then the other one, which is still a bit of a flavorful element, but it has a little bit more substance to it on a fundamental level. I can refer to it for information. Now I can identify other objects that have an even more substantial, fundamental, nutritious value to them, let's say. The Bible being one of them, of course. This microphone is quite important to the process of my discipline, my exploration into the text. It is something of a facilitator for which I may not be as motivated if I were not speaking into this microphone, if I were just reading it outright. It gives me an outlet. It gives me a way to keep myself honest and to place my attention where it ought to be. It grounds my attention. And the same is with this computer that is recording my audio. And as I look at the computer now, I can appreciate the sound waves as they sort of appear on the screen. Okay, so what I've tried to establish so far is the gradation that these material objects have in terms of their value. And the obstacle now is to determine, well, what exactly is it that determines what is valuable that I attribute to these physical objects, to the material world. I'd like to bring in one more object before I start to answer that question, because not all objects are related in the same way, or perhaps I should say not all objects do I relate to in the same way. So I may find the Bible and this microphone and the computer quite valuable. There is another object that is close to me, although I cannot quite see it right now, but I know it's not far. I think it's just behind my computer. It is an object that was my mother's, and it has sentimental value. There's almost a memory that is wound up in it that, given to somebody else, it may be valuable, but not to the degree that I value it and cherish it. And so, although this object is not the same as the Bible, I cannot open it up. Although it is something that I can open, it is not something that I can open up and read and continuously reflect on different words and different verses. This is something that perhaps I can open and I can reflect on experiences, memories, something that was and something that is held here now by my relationship to this physical object. So I say that to say that there are different ways that we can be related to these physical objects, and yet they can all hold quite a high level of value. And so I would say that not all value is the same. I think it depends on context. There's a certain fluidity to it. and by knowledge shall the chambers be filled with all precious and pleasant riches. So going back to the question then, what is it about these objects that hold value? Now, as I've said, some objects are more valuable than others. There's a certain aspect that certainly depends on my experience. I think there's another aspect which would depend on our cultural or socioeconomic status or composition. And in that way, to others, perhaps that which has least meaning to me, which is a Salvador Dali painting on my wall, may have the most value in terms of, purchasing power, in which somebody may use that transmission or temporary store of value to procure money, to use that money to buy other material objects for which they can form the types of relationships that they would wish to form. And there are many things that would do this. And I think it requires a discerning mind to find the material objects that are worthwhile, and not just sort of a fleeting, colorful flavor. So, this business of value is tricky. It's slippery. Now, although I had mentioned something that's a bit outside of my experience, I don't wish to go too far outside of my experience. For this journey, any religious journey, I think, is the exploration of one's own way. Of course, we are all trying to find goodness, and there's a certain standard of goodness, but the way in which we approach it, or the way in which we interface it, will always be different. We are just wired differently. In many ways, there are overlap. There's ways in which we can identify and relate similarly, and yet there's so many different weights through which we can attribute value to various experiences. We feel differently at different moments, at different times. I am not the same person that I was this morning that I am now. In some sense I am, but myself is a dynamic thing. It is not something that ought to be valuing its desires or its feelings, perhaps, above all else. There are plenty of things that I must sacrifice from a feeling standpoint in order to obtain some higher level of satisfaction. Now, I guess we can argue that at some level it's all desire, because there is this concept of satisfaction at higher levels. Perhaps that's something to come back to at a different time. So again, what are the fundamental components that make up my experience, more precisely perhaps, make up my relationship to material objects? Now, I mentioned value. Now, the word precious and pleasant are words that I think refer to this value. They imply something good. They imply something more than the superficial. Of my experience now, since it is most immediate and probably easiest to recognize, what is it about this Bible? And I've mentioned a little bit here, but perhaps it's useful to do again. Perhaps we'll get a little bit farther. This microphone and this computer What is it exactly that's valuable? Now, of the three physical objects that I've mentioned, Bible, microphone, and computer, I would say that the Bible is the most valuable. The other two are sort of adjuncts that facilitate. The computer and the microphone serve that role. But the fundamental component being the Bible, what is it about this? Now I can go through different aspects of knowing, perhaps, that I might find on Google or through some university professor. I might have some material explanation for why my mind can be considered to know something. But not to be forgotten is my experience, which is important. What is not to be forgotten is the all too afflicted or imperfect, I think imperfect is a better word, heart. Including the things that these days that we would wish to avoid or to deny, and to remain what we would call objective. I wish to keep these present. What is truly valuable here? Now, I mentioned the relationship, so it is not just items within the Bible, it's not just items within this verse. It is the interface that I am having with the information that I think holds a lot of value. I think the Bible in and of itself, as I've mentioned earlier about the difference between the two images on my wall, they are both images. One I attribute greater value to than the other. I think in a like manner, the Bible itself, if I were to close it, and if I were just to reflect on all of the information that's within it, but not any particular verse, and then compare that to having this book opened to page 727, and to examine a particular verse in a particular chapter, in this case chapter 24, verse 4, the way in which I'm reflecting or experiencing the object is different. It's has different contextual landscape. I think inherently the book open, the second condition, is more meaningful because it's more interactive. There's something that I am gaining. There's something that is being accomplished. Much like the plans for building a house, there is purpose that is being built into the system, that is being developed, that can be added to the material world. The heavenly principle is being downloaded into me such that I can manifest it in the world. And because there is such complexity, I think, in the world, it almost seems to me that examining the fundamentals like I am has very little carryover. But the fundamentals are those that we really don't think about. We don't think about the metal beams that hold up our house. We think about that which is immediate. Again, what we have within our spaces, what we have within our cupboards, within our refrigerators, what we have within our room, what clothes that we have, what books that we read, what people that we choose to invite into that space. So to summarize, I would say that the knowledge that fills the chamber with precious and pleasant riches is that heavenly principle that comes down to us, that is afforded to us, that we are able to see by virtue of our interface with that which is. It is that heavenly principle, that purposeful, meaningful element that in some sense is particular to our level or our dimension in the sense that if we can say that there are different dimensions or different degrees through which an agent can experience that which is, given our dimension or our degree of freedom, that heavenly principle appears to us in many ways. But of the many ways, I think that there are ways that are best. I think that there is a sufficient number of ways that keeps life interesting and open, but also a sufficient number of ways that are contrary, and that would lead us to ruin. A difficult matter. But much like living and staying alive, it requires a certain type of stress, a certain type of force placed on the mind or the body to keep it healthy. If I was to just lay in my bed for the next month, I would deteriorate and I would atrophy quite a bit. My health would suffer. And so although that life can be unpleasant, and that precious and pleasant riches may seem vague and subjective from our own standpoint, it is through lived experience and through vigorous self-reflection that I think we come to appreciate that which is fine and truly precious. Again, the ways may be multiple, but as long as we are ascending rather than descending, and we can justify it given our reason, I think we are sitting in a good place. So I think I'm going to end this episode here. Lately I've been going a bit long on my episodes, around 4 hours, but I like to cut it down, maybe keep it around 3 hours, or 2.5 hours. So I'll continue next time with verse 5 of chapter 24.